This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome you all once again to Baby Criticare 2020. So till now we able to understand how to give fluids with respect to fluid responsiveness, choice of the fluids, and also we have understood what is heart failure, which is right heart failure, and how our cardiac monitoring will be helpful in these patients. But till now we have not discussed, once we give fluids in this patient, what are the goals. So we have here expertise, Dr. Sumalata, a critical care specialist, intensivist from JSS Medical Institute, Mysuru. Madam will discuss on defining goals of resuscitation in critical ill patient, which is the most important topic in all ICU critical ill patient as well as maybe in intra-patient also. So I will request Dr. Sumalata Madam to carry on with her presentation, defining goals of resuscitation in critical ill patient. Thank you, Madam. Thank you for your, first of all, I welcome you for this Webby Criticare 2020. And I also thank you for your valuable time. Proceed to you, Madam.
Thank you, sir, for the introduction. It's an opportunity for us young physicians to reach out to young minds. I'm very glad to help exam going students. So today's class, we have, I'm not a pedantic person. I'm not going to teach you much facts. What we are going to discuss is try and define some goals for this class, and at the end of it you should understand certain concepts. If your concepts are clear, you can resuscitate any patient. So this class I try to cover resuscitation, when to start and when to stop. Something on EGDT because it's always asked in exams, and societal guidelines, what is told, what is untold, and case scenarios. After learning through all those theoretical aspects, how to apply it at the bedside, and what targets you will expect to come up in the next decade. So the question is when to start resuscitation. So in a resource poor setting, and say most of us have worked in a setting where there is only 5 or 6 bedded ICU, no invasive monitors, hardly you will have one SpO2 probe, one NIBP monitoring, and one ECG cable. So we have worked already in such settings also. So in this setting, what you are going to use? So physicians have been worldwide using traditional targets. So you don't have much to assess. So first you will go to your clinical skills. That is, check whether there is any altered ventilation, see if there is any decreased urine output, check for the high heart rate, see the blood pressure on your NIBP cuff, and feel the peripheral pulses. Cold, clammy extremities, warm extremity, how it is. So this is how a traditional physician has been making decision in the yesteryears. But are our estimates correct? So studies have shown cardiac output. What we are trying to do at the bedside is we have to optimize the cardiac output. Goal of resuscitation is clear-cut optimization of cardiac output. So what are the surrogates of cardiac output at the bedside clinically is a physician decided, altered ventilation, whatever aspects I talked in the previous slide. So these estimates of cardiac outputs based on physician were correct only in 40 to 60% of the times. That means you flip a coin, you ask your OT or your ICU technician to flip a coin, heads come, give fluids, tails come, don't give fluids. Then also you are as much correct as you use your clinical examination. Why? Because there are a myriad of factors that affect cardiac output in a critically ill patient. You may be correct in ward, you may be correct in OPD, but hell no, you are totally wrong when it comes to critically ill patients, because there are numerous factors which affects the physician estimates. We need something more than the traditional markers like your heart rate, altered ventilation, blood pressure. So what more is that we can add to this armamentarium at the bedside in a resource poor setting? So one thing that has been clinically come up and it has been studies have shown promise is skin modeling. It is a semi-quantitative approach. You can make it quantitative based on the certain if you have like microscope. So parameters. Semi-quantitative approach is how much is the modeling that is present around the knee. Why only knee? Knee has very high number of adrenergic receptors. So when there is shock, natural catecholamine release happens and perfusion to the capillaries around the knee comes down significantly. So modeling starts at first there. The person to study all this was Etofella. I have to give credit to him. Please read about him if you want to learn more about skin modeling. It has shown very good correlation with lactate. It predicts survival. That means if modeling improves after you give fluids, likely that this patient is going to survive. Its predictive capacity is equivalent to lactate. So do not fret that you are in a small setup, you don't have an ABG, I can't see lactate. If you see mottling, then try and resuscitate, and if the mottling goes, you are sure that this patient's survival is much better. The 14-day mortality with mottling resolving is only 12% compared to mottling mortality. So what is the scoring? This is it. So first a coin, zero means no mottling. A small coin shaped mottling area around the knee will be 1. Entire kneecap and superior area of the kneecap will be 2. Mid of thigh will be 3. And then mottling up to groin is 4. More than 4 is that 5 means beyond the groin. So this has been well validated in studies as a very good predictor of requirement of resuscitation and mortality. Next is another important finding is capillary refill time. So this again was done by Etofella. He's a French physician, and Hernandez. Hernandez is from Latin America. This is very easy to learn, inexpensive, reliable, and bedside. You can do it bedside repeatedly. Okay. So you just have to compress the nail bed for 15 seconds and release and see how much time it takes for the color to return. And this has been an objective, it has been made more objective by using a chronometer, the return of color. For that they used a chronometer. This is Hernandez and their group, and published a study that is a landmark study, your Andromeda shock trial. So it was done in Latin America, encompassing 28 centers in 5 countries. What they did was they resuscitated based on lactate in one arm and capillary refill time in another arm. So what it showed was there is no mortality difference. You can as well use capillary refill time as much as the lactate time. In fact, this mortality difference was not seen statistically, but clinically the mortality difference was some 8%. It did not attain statistical significance, but there was some mortality benefit clinically. Compared to lactate group, the capillary refill time group had less fluid given in the first 8 hours, less adrenaline used. So it is possibly more safer than lactate guided resuscitation. So if you are in a peripheral setup, please use capillary refill time. So to start resuscitation, if you add skin mottling and capillary refill time along with the traditional markers, what you are going to achieve is, studies have shown that you can achieve your specificity of 98%. That means the capillary refill time was increased and you saw a skin mottling. This shows that your patient's cardiac output is low and you are correct 98% of the times. So it rules in a low flow states. So if these signs are present, you can go ahead and resuscitate this patient. So you are much better compared to flipping a coin at the bedside. So if these signs are present, please use them. Now we'll move on to a reasonable resources where you have a CVC, you can place a CVC, you can place an arterial line, you have ABG available and a temperature probe through which you can monitor core temperature, not just peripheral, core temperature. This is a reasonable setting. So what all you can use? Here I would like to divide it into macrocirculatory targets and microcirculatory targets. Macrocirculatory targets, most often, most widely used is lactate and mean arterial blood pressure. Here when I mean mean arterial blood pressure, I would mean mean arterial blood pressures monitored through invasive blood pressure monitoring, especially in unstable patients. I do not mean by non-invasive monitoring. Second, other acid-based parameters are your pH-based deficit. Some parameters like mixed and central venous oxygen saturation has also been studied. They have come and they are fading away also. Another upcoming thing is difference between core and your peripheral temperature, the gradient between core and peripheral temperature. Let's just discuss each and everything. So lactate, it's much more objective criteria compared to your capillary refill time, and irrespective of source, where the lactate is coming from, why it is high, is it because of overproduction or decreased clearance, whatever it is, high lactate means high mortality. So you see a high lactate, you expect the patient's mortality to be likely higher than somebody who has a normal lactate. And serial measurements help us in actually seeing which course the patient is taking. So most studies, this is a general mortality I found through most studies. Any lactate more than 4 is 40% mortality, more than 10 is 80%, more than 24 hours, if the same lactate remained high, then you have 95% mortality in the next 48 hours. So it is that important. So, but we know how the lactate is generated and metabolized. I'll just remind the exam going students. See, it's basically pyruvate is converted to lactate under oxidative phosphorylation. If you have oxygen, 36 ATPs are generated. If there is lack of oxygen, 2 ATPs are generated, and the pyruvate gets converted to lactate, and this becomes the source of production. So how safe is it to use only lactate? Does it have any pitfalls? So pitfalls is you can have normal lactate despite tissue hypoperfusion. Why? Because your liver is clearing the lactate very fast. So despite you having evidence of shock, you can still have a normal lactate. So what are we going to do if you see normal lactate, but other parameters are telling that this patient, there is shock-like state, tissue perfusion is not adequate. So keep in mind that this is the moment you will have to think about other clinical parameters or lab parameters, where if those are abnormal, you will have to continue resuscitation. You can have increased lactate despite normal perfusion. When you have increased aerobic metabolism itself, when you are giving metformin, when you are giving beta blockers, beta agonists, and you have increased production per se. So these are all the cases where you can have increased lactate despite normal perfusion. So keep in mind when you are assessing lactate as a goal for resuscitation. So when you are resuscitation by means, it could be fluids, it could be vasopressors, whatever it is, whatever you are giving, make sure that if you are using sole lactate as an endpoint, as a goal, you know the pitfalls of it. And normalization of lactates within 6 hours is the strongest predictor of survival in septic shock. Lab wise, if you want one thing to say that this patient may survive, the family asks you, and you see lactate normalization, this is the strongest predictor that the patient is going to survive. So what is the evidence for lactate guided therapy in intensive care? So this is a classical study. This is a landmark study by Janssen. They found that without lactate and with lactate, if you guide and resuscitate, there is a mortality benefit. So exam going students should know about this study. Next is acid-base targets. Acid-base targets, easiest is your pH and base excess. Rather than pH, base excess is better because you are now going to remove the respiratory compensation part of the thing that affects your pH. Base excess is what? It is amount of base that is required to rise 1 liter of whole blood to the predicted pH based on the PCO2. So the PCO2 component is removed. It's a calculated value according to this formula. So you can have mild, moderate and severe. So where is the utility of base excess? Base excess utility is mainly in trauma, especially in trauma patient. The higher the base deficit, more it is telling that the volume of crystalloids that is required, the blood replaced is also requirement is more, and hence more mortality. So despite your resuscitation, base excess remains more than 6 has been a mortality predictor. So if in trauma you have a base excess which remains high, you will possibly have to continue to resuscitate and possibly expect a higher mortality. So next will be what is commonly known to all of us, that is mean arterial pressure. My question is, why are we measuring mean arterial pressure? Because we never got, the science never got to know the way to measure flow to each and every organ. Before the flow measurement techniques were developed, pressure measurement techniques were developed. Rivarossi found a sphygmomanometer which can measure the blood pressure, and we started assuming that resistance remains constant. In such condition, if you measure the pressure, it will tell the flow to end organ. Say this patient, I have a patient particularly at present with sepsis AKI. If I measure renal arterial pressure, it is understood that it is a surrogate marker of renal blood flow. That was the background principle behind which we started measuring arterial pressures. So, however, it is not true. Certain conditions, the resistance may be very high and the flow might get affected, and it may not be a complete, it will not give you complete picture as to whether the organ is getting perfused or not. So this is why we should have a flow monitor rather than pressure monitor. So what MAP target to set? Does higher MAP target improve the outcomes? This was addressed by sepsis-PAM trial. This trial showed that if you keep, this was actually the target when they set out, they tried to see if you keep MAP more than 75 versus MAP more than 65, does it give any mortality benefit? But what they ended up doing is, most of the trial patients had the trial arm MAP was more than 75 and trial arm MAP was more than 85, whereas control arm MAP was more than 75. So it was a little higher than usual recommended targets of 65. But what they showed was it was renoprotective in chronic hypertensive. That means incidence of AKI came down in a subgroup of patients who had hypertension. Otherwise, there is no mortality benefit using a higher MAP target for resuscitation versus lower MAP. Lower MAP here means 65. But it also caused more atrial fibrillation. So as of now, MAP target remains to be 65 because it is the driving pressure for perfusions for all organs. However, in trauma, you have some concept called permissive hypotension. That is, you keep a much lower MAP target. Previously, we had a consensus statement given by ESICM. We said keep the MAP target to 40. This was in 2007. Then 2014 guidelines said that you keep a lower MAP target, remove the 40 number. But in trauma, this permissive hypertension is important because you need to have source control. If you keep without source control, if you keep MAP high, you may end up losing a lot more blood and mortality may be high. This is the concept of mean arterial pressure as a target during resuscitation. What to do when MAP is normal? Does it mean normal blood pressure means there is no shock? That is not true. Normal blood pressure means that pressure more than 90 or not having more than 40% drop in regular blood pressure. Say there is a chronic hypertensive whose blood pressure is 160 or 180 by 120. If his blood pressure drops to 40% of his previous blood pressure, then only it is considered as a low mean arterial pressure. But he can still have a normal mean arterial pressure for his particular age and whatever baseline target, and yet develop shock. For this, some people have used fancy words like cryptic shock, compensated shock. But remember that normal blood pressure is not equivalent to not having shock. Shock can still be present despite having normal blood pressures. It is this phase of compensated shock that you need better endpoints to guide resuscitation. You need to determine when to start and when to stop resuscitation when MAP is normal, but other signs are suggestive of having shock. So in such situations, what options do we have? One major option is your mixed and central venous oxygen saturation. It was the reverse study, the first EGDT study that fueled the central venous oxygen measurement. Before that, it was being used, but not as widespread after the EGDT. EGDT trial showed that if you maintain the central venous oxygen saturation of more than 70%, the mortality is less, among the other things. So worldwide, the scientific community tried and tested this goal of resuscitation. So whole concept behind it is, see, the venous oxygen content is a marker of how much of oxygen is delivered to the tissue and how much is utilized by the tissue. So what is remaining, the remaining oxygen in the venous blood will tell you whether the delivery was adequate or whether the utilization was adequate. Normally what happens, brain utilization of oxygen is more compared to lower half of the body. So when you measure mixed venous saturation, mixed venous means whole blood is mixed. So this comes from pulmonary artery catheterization. It does not come, you will not get through a regular central venous catheterization. So there, if you measure, normally it is somewhere around 65. Whereas, sorry, normally it is around 70-75. Whereas brain oxygen utilization, since it is more, what we put as a central line axis, it stays at somewhere around superior vena cava. So there, if you measure, the oxygen saturation will be somewhere around 65. So instead of putting a PA catheter, can we use a CVC, regular catheters what we use, take the saturation from there and see whether the cardiac output is matching the requirement of tissues. So for what we are seeing is whether the cardiac output is adequate for tissues. So this, however, is not true in shock-like states. Shock-like states, what happens is your mesenteric blood flow comes down. So there is mesenteric vasoconstriction. The tissue utilization of oxygen goes up. So you will have central venous oxygen saturation. If you push the catheter into the right atrium and measure exactly, there will be some mixing of blood. So here the oxygen saturation will be much lesser. So what reverse thought was, instead of using a PA catheter, use your CVC, which is pushed into the right atrium, and measure oxygen saturation in shock-like state. And if you find low saturation, try and resuscitate with fluids or vasopressors to a point that it reaches 70%. If you target 70%, it may improve outcomes, was the conclusion of his study. But we can see lot of pitfalls in this. Why? Because if you attain the target of 70%, that means the utilization of the oxygen by the tissues is not ensured. If you see the mortality and the relationship between mortality and the central venous oxygen saturation, it is U-shaped. It is not linear. If it were linear, we could have used this fantastic principle. Problem here is, if you have a low saturation, why there is central venous oxygen saturation is low? Can anyone tell why the central venous oxygen saturation is low? I just now told. Because the tissue utilization of oxygen is high. Okay, so even if you optimize your cardiac output by giving fluids or vasopressors, the tissue oxygen utilization has come down. The problem is at tissue level, problem is at mitochondrial level. So if you target a 70% central venous oxygen saturation, the mortality is not going to improve if the problem is at tissue level. So if you have low saturation also, there is a high mortality. What if you have very high saturation? Very high saturation is also a very big red flag. Why? Because there is absolutely no oxygen uptake at the tissue level that's happening. So this is what studies have found. There is a big biological pitfall here, because the mortality and the SCO2 is a U-shaped curve. It is not a linear curve. So this is why SCO2 went out of picture, because the biological rationale was not strong. Some studies were done, some studies showed it was equivalent to lactate also. Jones especially did this study. It was shown that it was equivalent to lactate, but later on it could not be replicated. If you use central venous oxygen saturation target as 70%, if you keep and if you resuscitate your patient, there was no mortality benefit replicated in multiple studies, because there was not a good biological. Next was peripheral and core rationale behind the principle. So temperature gradient, this is an attractive concept. What happens when you develop shock? Naturally the cutaneous blood flow goes down. Body is designed to preserve the blood flow to vital organs. So you have cutaneous vasoconstriction. If the patient is in a stable ambient temperature, like ICU temperature, where you have fixed the temperature, the temperature does not change. So degree of cutaneous vasoconstriction is directly proportional to circulatory insufficiency. Higher the vasoconstriction, more the circulatory insufficiency. This has a proper biological rationale. So studies have shown that any gradient between core temperature and cutaneous. Core temperature here was tympanic measure. So tympanic to toe gradient more than 7 degrees was suggestive of requirement of fluid resuscitation and higher mortality. In fact, more studies have come up where any gradient between fingertip and forearm itself will tell. Even a single degree gradient tell that this patient has shock. So you can start resuscitation. To start resuscitation, this is an extremely good concept. And when you resuscitate, if there is increase in peripheral temperature, there is improvement in circulation and mortality benefit. Despite this being a sound biological rationale, there is a pitfall in this. Why? Sepsis, as we know, has a lot of inflammatory mediators, and most of them are pyrogens. So the fever, when it develops, can itself cause a lot of hypothalamic disturbances and cause this cutaneous vasoconstriction may be lost, and many of us have seen warm peripheral bounding pulses. So this is when you don't have a core and cutaneous temperature difference. However, studies have found this to be some useful concept. We need something like Andromeda shock trial to be done versus lactate and this. If someone can prove through an RCT that it is equivalent to lactate. Maybe in our centers, especially third world countries where it is resource poor, you can just try and resuscitate with this because you only need a core temperature probe. Otherwise, you can use this, and it's a very good resuscitation marker. So this was when you have a regional setup. Next will be ideal world. You are in a fantastic setup in West. You are a professor, under you lot of research fellows are there. So that will be a ideal world. In such patients, in such setup, when patients come, how would you resuscitate? What extra goals of resuscitation will you add, which acts as trigger for you to start resuscitation? That is my assessment of microcirculatory blood flow at the sublingual level, especially the buccal mucosa and tongue, how the microcirculation is happening. Next will be near infrared spectroscopy and buccal and gastric capnography. That means partial pressure of oxygen at the buccal mucosa and the stomach. That also has been studied. And this is one more attractive microcirculatory endpoint, that is your carbon dioxide, not central, it's peripheral venous and arterial carbon dioxide gradient. This can also be done in our setup. So if you can do a ABG and VBG from a peripheral artery and vein and see the gradient there, that is also a reflection of microcirculatory endpoint. Coming to sublingual microcirculation, so this has been widely studied. It is slowly gaining foothold in critical care. We had handheld microscopes. What you see in those microscopes is how are the capillaries at the sublingual level. See the density, how of them are perfused, see the heterogeneity, and based on that, it is a reflection of microcirculation in other organs. Basically, microcirculation is any capillaries with less than 100 micron diameter. The whole concept here is we are targeting only macrocirculation. Till now, we thought that flow means it is only convective, cardiac output, heart blood is pumped, oxygen is carried through RBCs and it's delivered to the tissues. That is not true. This is a convective flow. What happens at the tissue level is a diffusion process. Through the RBC, oxygen diffuses, passes through the interstitium, reaches the cell. So there is a diffusive process also. And if there is any disturbance at this diffusive process, you will have microcirculatory abnormalities despite having normal cardiac outputs. That is your macrocirculation being normal. This is termed as your decoupling of micro and macro circulation. So this is an entirely new, I will not term new, it is a concept with sound biological rationale, and because this has been shown that this loss of hemodynamic coherence, this is termed as hemodynamic coherence, has been shown to worsen mortality, and it has been widely proven in sepsis that there will be loss of hemodynamic coherence. So there are 4 types of microcirculatory abnormality that you can see in sepsis. This is just for exam going students. If they ask any question on microcirculation, you can answer this. I don't know the pattern of your examination. I just assume that this may be helpful. So usually you have heterogeneity. Some capillaries are not at all perfused, whereas some are well perfused. This is seen in sepsis with very high pro-inflammatory state. Whereas if you over resuscitate the patient, that means you have given fluids for sepsis that has caused hemodilution. Here what happens, the distance between the RBCs and the tissue is increased, and per unit area you have lesser RBC. So the diffusion process is affected here. Whereas type 3 means you will have more microcirculatory abnormalities due to vasopressors that you have given. There is a significant vasoconstriction of capillaries and diffusion of RBCs, passage of RBCs through this is getting affected. Type 4 is lot of endothelial glycocalyx being damaged and whatever is in the intravascular system is entering the interstitium, more protein, that is causing tissue edema. So where do we stand? What is the use of knowing all these microcirculatory abnormality? How will it help in patient care? If you see type 2 or type 3, you are in West, you have students, you are doing an RCT, and when you held a side stream dark field microscope and you saw type 2 microcirculatory abnormality, that means you will have to stop your resuscitation. You are giving more fluids. Say you saw type 3 abnormality, you will have to decrease your MAP target. Even though MAP is 65, you will possibly benefit by decreasing your MAP target to possibly 60 also, because microcirculation is now getting affected. I hope you all understood this concept. So there is microcirculatory flow index also has been defined, where any microcirculatory flow index less than 2.3, fluid resuscitation is helpful. Some studies have shown that if you decrease vasopressor dose in type 3 microcirculatory failure, it improves mortality. But all these are observational studies. Till now, there is no RCT. If somebody comes and compares this with lactate guided resuscitation, it is excellent. Other aspects of this microcirculatory abnormality utilization is some drugs also has been tried, that is nitroglycerin, to improve the microcirculatory flow, but this has not been found beneficial in large human studies, but animal studies showed some benefit. What is promising is use of steroids. What steroids have been shown to do is they have shown to increase the microcirculatory flow index and decrease all these abnormalities that you would have seen on your sublingual microscopy. So this way steroids may be helpful in septic shock. So you have one more biological rationale to use steroids in cases of septic shock. Am I going too fast? The crowd is awfully silent.
No, you are okay, madam.
Okay. So next will be NIRS. NIRS is near infrared spectroscopy. What we do is, this is a very budding technology. You just put a transcutaneous probe here and you just monitor the saturation. So if the transcutaneous probe saturation is less compared to your PaO2, that means your arterial oxygenation, there is a microcirculatory abnormality here also. The ratio, if it is less than 0.7, it is indicative of poor circulation, but this is in very nascent stage. The signal to noise ratio, what you call for a technology to be good, no, that is not very good. You have lot of extraneous system affecting your saturation probes. So this is upcoming. If we get this is also something very good, which is because it is non-invasive and it is easy to calculate your PaO2. You get in every APG. So this can become a new goal to start resuscitation. It can add to our armamentarium. There are multiple targets. Among the targets, if you add NIRS also, with NIRS showing the transcutaneous saturation to arterial saturation ratio being less than 0.7, then it is one more additional criteria to start resuscitation. Buccal and gastric capnography, I'll just mention it. The whole idea behind this is hypoperfusion to splanchnic circulation. You will have an increased PCO2. So even though your MAP is normal, this is a state where shock is continuing. This is more, so if you pick up a higher PCO2 in gastric and buccal mucosa, so likely that your patient is in shock, please resuscitate. This is the signal that it gives us. So it is especially used in trauma, but lot of inter-individual variability is being seen and still lacks standardization. It is at a nascent stage. Next, we will go to the arterial and venous CO2 gradient. So normally in a peripheral vein, if you do an VBG and peripheral artery, you do an ABG, the gradient is less than 4 mm of mercury. So more than 6 mm states that despite your perfusion, the tissue oxygen utilization and carbon dioxide generation has been high. So it suggests hypoperfusion. However, it has not been uniformly seen in all patients. See, what happens is, if you have very high cardiac output state, the CO2 that is even though there is anaerobic metabolism and CO2 generation being very high, what happens is the CO2 is now washed off by your increased cardiac output. So your gradient remains less than 4. You think that there is no shock. So to overcome this problem, a ratio of peripheral carbon dioxide difference to central oxygen utilization. This is central oxygen content difference, arterial and venous, to a peripheral CO2 arterial and venous ratio if you do, and if it is less than 1.4, it was found to be normal. Anything more than 1.6 suggestive of shock. It could be at the tissue level or at the macrocirculatory level. This is also one attractive concept, but you will need to do a lot of ABGs and VBGs for this. Coming to the traditional 5-6 years back, which caused a lot of noise, is your EGDT, goal-directed resuscitation. Goal here is having a MAP more than 65, targeting your hemoglobin at a certain level, and keeping your SCVO to more than 70%. There was a it generated lot of debate, and the dust has now settled. Despite the dust settling, I'm talking about this because exam going PGs should know. So you should know reverse, promise, process, and arise trial, and one PRISM meta-analysis done out of all 3 trials. So this is a summation of the table. It becomes too pedantic if I go into all of this. I just put it here because the slides are available. The students can go back and read. So what has shown is clear cut. There is no outcome benefit by having a particular goal directed resuscitation in terms of MAP, central venous oxygen, using PRBCs to keep your high hemoglobin target. But I would still credit reverse, because what it did was it raised worldwide awareness as to reach a certain target for sepsis. So now if a septic patient comes, because of all these trials, we have all become very aware to resuscitate early. So this education, what we have achieved, is the credit should go to reverse. So what are the guidelines that are there as to have at present what goals we have to resuscitate? Survive sepsis 2016 update, you have a certain guideline as to fixed volume, resuscitate, give 30 ml per kg within 3 hours. This resuscitation goal was set in 2016 guidelines. This has caused a lot of people in America to take, a lot of doctors in America are taking Pantadop because of this, because it has given a lot of stress for them. Usually America is an insurance driven setup, no? So if you don't follow these guidelines and these particular targets are not attained within the fixed time, what you end up doing is you end up losing insurance benefits for your patients, since target are not achieved. The heartburn is all the more because you have to give antibiotics within the first hour, which is I also personally feel was completely irrational given the kind of antibiotic abuse that we are having. And the fixed volume resuscitation, what the 30 ml they have told, is given even for ESRD and heart failure patients, which has raised lot of eyebrows. But some rational explanation they have given is these triumvirate of goal-directed resuscitation, promise, process, and arise. All these trials, when they had a certain goal and they resuscitated, the initial 3 hours, the fluid requirement was 30 ml per kg in all 3 trials. So what they have used is, because such a large number of patients, irrespective of whatever pathology they had, when they came in septic shock, they required 30 ml per kg fluid within earlier hours. We have fixed this volume. That is their rationale. So if somebody asks you the goal of why a fixed volume 30 ml was chosen, can you criticize? Please say the pros and cons of it. it may fetch you some additional points. So next is map target. They have fixed a map target of 65. I have discussed the map already. Next, the third one is lactate normalization. They have advocated to normalize lactate as early as possible with hourly some 10% decrement and all. But as I said, lactate kinetics is not linear. So if you aim for lactate normalization, you may end up giving more fluids because lactate is liver clearance is dependent on your liver function, your kidney function, and production is again dependent on multiple other factors apart from sepsis. So lactate normalization may not be a very good goal. Compared to the previous guideline, they have removed CVP and they have put a word of caution for SCVO2 telling that it may not be beneficial. So which is a good thing. What I would be happy is quoting ESICM consensus statement, because even though this came in 2014, they have addressed the unmet goals much better than Survive Sepsis campaign. So what they have done is, here itself they said that map target more than 65 years, but it has to be individualized. And they removed the 40 target that was there for trauma patients in previous guidelines. And what they have said is higher map target should be considered in patients who are chronic hypertensive, and individualization is important. They have also stressed on lactate, SCVO2, and in 2014 itself, peripheral arterial and venous CO2 gradient they have stressed on, which is a good part that they are exploring other goals of resuscitation, not just one or two. And for microcirculatory assessment, a word of caution was there that use it only for research purpose, not at
Leave meeting.
So apart from all of this, what they said, these are all guidelines to start resuscitation. One wonderfully beautiful statement they gave was, even in the context of fluid responsive patient, fluid management should be titrated carefully, especially in presence of elevated intravascular filling pressures or extravascular lung water. This is one statement that they have addressed in telling that, look, there is a limit to fluid resuscitation also. Please have some safety limits. This has not been addressed in Survive Sepsis guidelines. So when the next guidelines come out, it's supposed to come in 2019, it has not come. So what we as a young physician expect is, fluids are drugs. We need to have some safety limit. Please tell in the guidelines what safety limits should be used, because it is being followed worldwide. This is the one rationale and one thing we are expecting from Survive Sepsis next guidelines. So when to stop resuscitation, you will have to define certain safety limits. You just can't keep giving fluids indefinitely because your patient is fluid responsive, because it has its own effect. Renal vascular pressures come down, renal condition, intra-abdominal pressures rise. Cerebral edema can happen. You can have worsening heart failures, lung permeability is affected, and you can have hydrostatic developing fluid positive balance will cause difficult weaning, coagulation parameters. Every abnormality has been seen with giving excessive fluid resuscitation. So when you start resuscitation, in your mind, you should always have some safety limit. Look, if I attain these safety limit targets, if this crosses, I am going to stop. So this has to be inculcated in the present generation so that they become safe intensivist. So let's see what are all the safety limits that should be defined. CVP, yes, it is gone now, that it is not at all a good marker of preload. All of us have understood it, done and dusted, but there is some utility as a back pressure, as a marker of back pressures in end organ. Instead of using CVP for resuscitation, as a marker of preload, use it as a marker of venous pressure in end organs. So you are resuscitating, there is a central line already, you have a pressure transducer available. During resuscitation, you see more than 8 CVP, you should start worrying, and more than 12 is the time you should stop giving fluid bolus, provided your RARP is normal, because straight away your CVP is an indirect marker of RA pressures. And falling cardiac output is happening despite fluid resuscitation, and there is a rise in CVP. It's a definitive indication to stop fluid, because the problem is now in your heart. It is not in the volume status of the patient. So utility of CVP, is CVP completely gone from critical care CVP measurement? No, it is a very good marker for venous pressures in end organ. You can use it as a safety limiting when you are resuscitating patients, especially trauma patients where you just don't have the count of the number of fluid and blood products that you are giving. I would suggest to you to use the CVP. Next is poor man's extravascular lung water, your PF ratios and B lines. It is important in subset of ARDS patients, not in all other patients. Somebody with septic shock mods and ARDS, I would look at this. This is not been advocated in any guidelines, but as a clinician in ARDS patients, I would see this. Why? Because we all know ARDS is not a hydrostatic problem. It is hydrostatic pressures. It is a permeability problem. Whatever fluid you are going to give, some amount of it is going to enter your lungs, no matter what you do, because it is a problem at the alveolar level, a problem at the pulmonary capillary level. So you will have to look at your PF ratios when you are dealing with resuscitation. There is a severe ARDS, patient is on 100% oxygen, and PEEP is say some 10. If you give fluids, lungs will get flooded. Some amount of fluid is going to go into the lungs. But if you don't give fluids and the patient is fluid responsive, all other organs are as such going to get affected. So what are we going to do in such a scenario? I would possibly give a 100 ml bolus and see. So this is where PF ratios come in. In a severe ARDS, see your PF ratios, and if there is a rapid worsening after 100 ml bolus, you are looking at somebody with a huge permeability problem. Please prepare for ECMO, please prepare proning and the rest of the thing. Plan ahead. Despite for a mini fluid challenge causes a worsening PF ratio, drastic drop in PF ratio, this is a red flag. This is how I would use PF ratio. Same is to the B lines also. After you giving a 100 ml bolus, this is after patient being fluid responsive. This is not before patient being not your. This is not that your PLR, VTI, whatever maneuver caused showed that patient is not fluid responsive. I'm talking about all patients who are fluid responsive, who are measured by dynamic parameters, not by static, and not one dynamic, 2-3 dynamic parameters. Because you have to be absolutely sure in ARDS patients that this patient needs fluids. So once you are sure that this patient needs fluid, you give fluid in a smaller aliquots and see your PF ratio. Drastic worsening is there, you please prepare for ECMO. So already prone, already recruited, not maintaining saturation, and no money for ECMO. All of us has faced this situation, no? So what to do in such situation? Sir, what will you do, sir? Raghunath, sir?
Hello.
Sir, what will you do in such situations? You have
Already prone,
recruited, 100% oxygen, 14-15 PEEP, not maintaining saturation, fluid responsive, no money for ECMO.
okay, if is fluid responsive, just still again I'll try small boluses fluids.
Okay, so maybe that's the difference between an young and an experienced intensivist. I would just do this. I don't have an answer. This patient I will not be able to save, so I will just, that is my answer. Okay.
Carry on, madam.
So 1 second, I seem to have some problem here.
Okay.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, madam, we can hear.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you, ma'am.
Okay, sir. So, one second. So next will be an advanced setup. So you have everything available to you. You have a transpulmonary thermodilation available. Then what you do is, in such patients, do your extravascular lung water. So check for extravascular lung water. If it is indexed to body weight, it is all the more better. Indexed to height is much more accurate, is now the latest literature is showing. So if the extravascular lung water is less than 7 ml per kg, please give fluid in this patient. If the extravascular lung water is more than 10, you are going to have problems. You cannot give fluids. If you use pulmonary vascular permeability index, it is all the more specific because it is nothing but extravascular lung water divided by pulmonary blood flow. So anything more than 3 is suggestive of hydrostatic pulmonary edema, less than 3 is permeability pulmonary edema. So you can use it to stop fluids. You are giving fluid in an ARDS patient. Keep these two as an endpoint as to when you would want to stop fluids. Another safety limit you can define is intra-abdominal pressure. The person who is driving this concept is Manu Malbrain. So very attractive concept. So what happens is you give lot of fluids, it ends up in the venous system, raises the interstitial pressure. See, your perfusion pressure to all organs is mean arterial pressure minus your venous pressure at that particular organ. If I am talking at the kidney level, it is MAP minus renal venous pressure. If I am talking at pancreatic level, it is pancreatic venous pressure has to be deducted minus MAP. So any rise in intra-abdominal pressure will also tell that most of your fluid is entering the third space and causing more problem because of your microcirculatory abnormality. Your fluid may not be beneficial or may cause some harm if you use it indiscriminately. So this is one attractive idea, but the problem is you have too many variables that affect your IAP. The patient has to be sedated, paralyzed. For you to measure IAP, you can measure at multiple levels: bladder, gastric mucosa, direct peritoneum, all those things. But you need to have, if the least invasive is your bladder, you will need to have triple lumen Foley's, so many other things that cause rise in intra-abdominal pressures affect your management. That is, say if your patient already has a paralytic ileus or a pancreatitis, you cannot use this. So best is, if you are using it, start using it early. All MODS patient, ideally, there is one World Federation for Intra-Abdominal Pressure Monitoring itself, all set up by Manu Malbrain himself. So what they say is, any MODS patient, you will have to start monitoring intra-abdominal pressure. If that is the case, if you are doing it, you would see the trend. If after fluid the trend shows a sudden rapid rise in IAP, it's an indication for you to stop the fluid bolus. So it will help you in having refining your techniques when you are giving fluid. So it's one additional armamentarium you can use. So in patients who don't have systolic dysfunction, diastolic dysfunction, you can also target a worsening E by E prime. As you can keep that as a safety limit. New guidelines have come which define the diastolic dysfunction. So what happens in sepsis is, sepsis can affect anything. It can affect your RV, it can affect your LV, it can cause LV diastolic dysfunction like state. So if you are looking at certain patient who has normal heart and now comes with septic cardiomyopathy and E by E prime is worsening, this is also an indicator that this patient fluid, he may not tolerate the fluid that we are giving. Why? Because higher E by E prime, that is, if you are measuring at the septal level more than 10 and lateral more than 15, is suggestive of higher pulmonary pressures. So you have a very narrow margin for resuscitation. instead of using say 2 liter, 3 liter initial fluid bolus, you do a screening echo and you saw diastolic dysfunction. I would start with possibly 500 ml aliquots. And when you're resuscitating after 6 hours, I would be really cautious when you're giving even that 500 ml aliquots. Problems is your heart rate, your catecholamine, your RV dilatation, everything can affect your E by E prime. So heart rate increases means diastolic time comes down. Diastolic time will affect your ventricular relaxation. So naturally your diastolic dysfunction, your E by E prime worsens. So all these things are there. Your RV dilates, pushes the septum to the LV. LV cannot fill well. So these things have to be kept in mind when you are interpreting E by E prime. So after learning all this theory, where do we stand at case scenarios? So given a certain subset of patients, after this class, how am I going to use it at the bedside? Is it going to be useful for me as an intensivist at the bedside? This is the big question, because whatever you monitor, whatever theory you know, unless it is translated into practice, you are not going to improve patient outcome. This was a classical case of PA catheters. Now you know a lot of things, but it didn't improve outcome because it didn't change the management much. So let's go into certain case scenarios. I have one patient, Mr. X. He is 65-year-old. He is diabetic since 15 years. He is on both metformin and insulin. He is hypertensive since 5 years on Telma. His IHT status post PTCA to LAD. This was 2 years back. He's on ecosprin still, and there is luckily no systolic dysfunction. So this is a classical case. Everyone will see every day almost you will get one case like this. Now this patient is in emergency. Please note the heart rate, vitals that I have given on the left side and the ABG on the right side. Okay, I'll give you the clinical scenarios later. So MAP is 60, heart rate is high, capillary refill is 8 seconds. Urine output in the, you just catheterized him, last hour is 30 ml. He has bilateral crepitations and saturation is 96. He has cold peripheries. PLR with VTIA shows fluid responsiveness. CNS wise he is restless. So are we clear on this case scenario?
I request students can open on their video and they can answer. Hello.
Hello. Yes,
Yeah.
sir. I'll just go ahead. I think this is a circadian rhythm when 3 to 5 everybody will be sleeping. So just to wake them up, I asked.
No. All are awake. No problem.
That means I am not boring them too much, hopefully.
No.
So this is the ABG. ABG wise, your lactate is 5. Okay. So this is one more red flag. So this case, now I'll give you the scenario. He is now has a bilateral pneumonia. He's on 6 liters of O2. So you have all clinical signs that says that there is inadequate perfusion, no? And one dynamic marker of fluid responsiveness is also telling you that he needs fluid. The lactate is also high, so you have 100% tick. If you want to tick the indications for goals for resuscitation, you have almost everything that is ticked. Okay, there is not even one single sign to tell us, please do not resuscitate. And what is the safety limit here? He could be a IHD, but LV systolic function is good, and he's on room air. He's on 6 liters of O2. That means LV function is not very bad. There is no pulmonary edema. We can assume this, not a very significant pulmonary edema. So in this patient, I would straight away give 2 liters of fluid bolus. Follow survival sepsis guidelines happily. Okay, but since he is an IHD patient, we don't know how sepsis will affect his heart. We don't know whether his disease has progressed in the last 2 years. He has 2 risk factors, no, diabetes and hypertension. We don't know whether one more coronary artery has become more atherosclerotic. So I would rather reassess him after 1 hour. Okay. I would not repeat too many investigation in him because he's not extremely sick patient. But if you have the luxury of lung ultrasound and echo, please do it in him, because you should know what kind of patients you are dealing with, how is the echo at present, and you should know how bad is the pneumonia. If you don't have lung ultrasound facility in your setup in the peripheries, don't worry, you are still safe. But please do reassess after 1 hour as to how much oxygen requirement is there, whether he's becoming more tachypneic, whether his saturation has dropped from 95 to 88 after the fluid. So these are all certain clinical red flags that you are going to see. Now, second scenario, with the bilateral pneumonia, now I do an echo and it shows diastolic dysfunction, no systolic dysfunction at all. This is the patient I would not follow cervical sepsis guidelines. I would give 500 ml aliquots, okay, rather than full 2-liter bolus. I would personally, you see, this is all subjective. This case scenario is totally subjective. It is not an expert recommendation antala. If you ask me how you would manage, I would give him 500 ml aliquots rather than 2 liters fluid bolus, and after 15 minutes I would see and repeat the ibuprofen. If there is a drastic worsening, you would worry in him. So because you would have to, this patient will need definitely little more fluids, but likely his heart function is going to worsen. So to make things safer, you will have to possibly closely monitor him. That means you would need more ABG, possibly talk to family, get ready for intubation. So these are all things that should keep in mind when you are resuscitating such a patient. Next will be, already this patient has pneumonia, but he is already intubated and mechanically ventilated. So before giving 2-liter fluid, I'll just do a baseline lung ultrasound because I am going to keep certain safety targets. Okay, there is no ARDS in this patient, but I would like to see how many B lines are there at the anterior. Even though if you have lung ultrasound AB profile, and after fluid the AB profile is slowly shifting to B lines more than 5, I would worry because he might progress to ARDS. So that's when your utility of having a safety limit comes in. You give 2 liters, definitely you give, but the problem here is you will have to define your fluid target. I would see if there is any worsening of PVF ratio if you don't have an ultrasound, worsening B line. Since he's mechanically ventilated, I assume most of you will also put a central line. So if central line is there, just see your CVP. If it is not there, it's okay. Do not worry. Keep a tab on your PF ratio. So one more scenario is septic shock with MODS. The same patient comes with bilateral pneumonia, septic shock with MODS. Here I would not worry to give fluids because all other organ perfusion is affected. Give off your fluid. As a part of screening, do your lung ultrasound, do your echo. Here I would use a little more sophisticated endpoints rather than your regular this thing. I would do a CVP, see if it's worsening when you are giving large amount of fluid. Keep an eye on IAP because he has got MODS. IAP utility is much more when you have an AKI. So if the patient MODS here mean, I would say AKI also. So I would rather do an CVP, monitoring, IAP monitoring, and you are in a very good setup where money is not an issue. You can do extravascular lung water and PVPI also, because likely because of MODS, extensive pneumonia, he'll go into, he will develop ARDS. Risk factor for ARDS is high. Say this patient comes with femur fracture, and after an RTA, bilateral lower limb fractures, femur fracture, humerus fracture, polytrauma, before source control, I would wait. So why? Because this patient MAP is 60. There is extensive signs of inadequate perfusion. But if you have not done source control and if you increase the MAP, you are just gonna let the patient bleed. So this patient, rather than resuscitating, I would call up my orthopedician first. Call up the anesthetist, prep the OT and say, look, I'm going to resuscitate and shift one patient. You please be ready. So this patient, instead of resuscitating, I would closely wait. One attractive concept that has come up is tech-based resuscitation. This you can do it in a higher setup when if TEG is available. See which component is getting affected and replace only that blood product and keep quiet. So this is before source control. The next will be a severe ARDS. This is a patient with bilateral pneumonia. He is now on 100% oxygen, 12 PEEP already. And what are you going to do? I would first look at the oxygenation. So prone the patient. Okay, some hemodynamic instability is there. So for that you have to give fluid. So what I would do is give 100 to 250 ml fluid. And if you don't have anything, do lung ultrasound score. You see the B lines, how much it is. See how you would, rather than doing a 6-point score, I would do a 28-point score maybe, and see how it is worsening, and reassess after every 15 minutes, and definitely use extravascular lung water in this patient as a safety target. If you are in a setup where you can use this, we can use. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone has worked till now. In the entire group, we are some 30 group people, I think, and none of us have used transpulmonary thermodilution yet. Is it true? Can I say this?
Yes.
So we have not reached that stage yet. But in a patient, if you have in a setup, if you are lucky to work in a setup like that, then maybe using an extravascular lung water will be a better safety target. So same patient after 6 hours, lactate is 2, MAP is 65. Patient is still fluid responsive, but mind you, as a reminder, the capillary refill time is now still 8 seconds and peripheries are still cold. So what are you going to do? So this is one ambiguous scenario. You have some signs to tell that this patient has some goals are attained, but there are some clinical clues as saying that shock is still there. It's persisting. So what are you going to do? The same patient, bilateral pneumonia on 6 liters of O2. So here I'd be little cautious. If you have a ABG in your setup, do a peripheral arterial and venous gradient. If that also shows less than 4, then I would not give anything. Okay. And you have a temperature probe in a good setup, tympanic and toe. The gradient is not more than 7. Don't do anything. Keep quiet. If both of them show higher gradient, then give a 500 ml Aliquots. Don't give very high and sit and wait. When do you stop fluid? During your 5 ml, after your 500 ml Aliquot, you see the lung B lines are worsening and USG. So this patient, because of your fluid resuscitation, may now may require mechanical ventilation. So please stop. Do not give any further fluid boluses. This is one. Some vague, what you say, stop target when the patient is on room air. If this patient has an echo shows LV diastolic dysfunction, I would wait. I would not give any fluid. Why? Because in multiple studies have shown that the mortality is worse in sepsis in a worsening LV diastolic dysfunction rather than the patient has a systolic dysfunction, LV or RV. So by giving fluids, what you are going to do is you are going to worsen the diastolic dysfunction. That is going to happen. There are some signs that is saying that fluid resuscitation has helped. So if you give some more fluid, you are going to definitely worsen the diastolic dysfunction. So that safety margin what we have for which you can give fluid in this patient is very narrow. So I would rather wait, knowing that much of our patients will eventually become positive balance in the next 2 to 3 days, which is going to worsen things as such for the heart. So why give unnecessary fluid? Just wait, watch, reassess after 6 hours. If after 6 hours MAP is not maintained, lactate is worsening, then you will have to see whether it is the cardiac output that is causing problem or the hypovolemia. Actually calculate the cardiac output using your VTI and stroke volume and see if reassess, see if it's fluid responsive, then give fluids, or possibly think of giving some or keeping quiet or giving dobutamine if MAP is high. That also you can think of. But in this patient, I would not give fluid. Next scenario, that is mechanical ventilation. Patient is already intubated, mechanically ventilated. He is fluid responsive. Dynamic variables, all dynamic variables have shown that he is fluid responsive. What are you going to do before starting resuscitation? So this patient, I would do complete examination again, lung ultrasound, echo. If you already have a center line, see what is the saturation through your center line, and put a temperature probe if possible. Check the gradient. I'm not telling do all of this. What are your options? You can do at least 2 to 3 of it. Establish that this patient has tissue hypoperfusion which is continuing. Once you establish, give 500 ml Aliquot. If there is no established evidence of ongoing tissue hypoperfusion, you can keep quiet. So what safety targets am I going to keep? Again, CVP. If rapid worsening in CVP, you will have to stop. Worsening PF ratios, B lines, no more fluids at any cost for this patient. Next scenario is again septic shock with MODS. Here I would see for IAP. If you have IAP monitoring, if IAP is too high, wait. Other things are, as usual, your peripheral laterovenous gradient, core and peripheral temperature gradient. And if you are very lucky, you are in an extremely good research setup, do sublingual microcirculation, because this is where you will have an idea as to what is causing whether you can give fluids. If there is no type 2 microcirculatory disturbance, you can give fluid. If there is no type 3 circulatory disturbances, maybe you can give vasopressor. So whatever it is, you can titrate it seeing the sublingual microcirculation. This is in a research setup. So what are your safety targets? Again, IAP, PF ratio. If you have your microcirculatory flow index more than 2.3 and your extravascular lung water high, I would not give fluid in this patient. Still wait. Trauma. After source control, I would monitor base excess because it's an excellent marker. And TEG based resuscitation, I would like to continue. If CVP is high, it's an indicator for you to be very cautious when you are giving blood products for this patient. Severe sepsis with ARDS, I would wait. Why? Because there are 2-3 parameters that is showing enough signs of resuscitation. 1 or 2 are there which is telling that situation shock may be persisting, but my goal is to save the lung here. So before even giving fluid, I would see what is the extravascular lung water, and I would rather see temperature and peripheral venous temperature gradient and peripheral arterial and venous partial pressure of CO2, the gradient, and I would possibly monitor that and not give fluid. This is a patient where I would be really worried about giving fluid. So after all this discussion, where are we heading? So next decade, what can we expect? We would expect more of NIRS, more refined technology, more signal, less noise, advanced generation coming in, maybe more affordable, and we can use in third world countries. That is one possibility. And some trials on some RCTs on sublingual microcirculatory assessment. In the next decade, if you get, and somebody like Hernandez, what he has done is landmark actually. So the same thing if can be done and comparing lactate, it would be really good because these are handheld microscopes. Even these things are going to become affordable in future on mass scale production. So they are going to be very beneficial if these are established as a goals for resuscitation. And this is one area where you can actually see what is causing what harm, whether our vasopressor is causing harm or whether our fluid is causing harm, and you have an entirely different level new indicator, because till now we didn't have a good microcirculatory indicator. If this becomes established, you can combine this with a macrocirculatory assessment, and if they both go hand in hand, we can actually save some patients. Next will be artificial intelligence and big data. It's come up very huge. What this is, you have voluminous data used to go through the data, and fuzzy logic is used. Fuzzy logic is Basically, how you take a judgment. You stand at the bedside. Your problem is patient has shock. Your goal is to resuscitate the patient. You have some certain safety limits. Your assessment of shock are 4-5 parameters. Each parameters will give you result as whether patient is completely 100% fluid responsive, or patient will may be fluid responsive, patient may benefit from treatment, patient will not benefit from treatment. This is your input to the brain. What your brain does is convert this gray area into black and white area. So what it does is it will assess every data that is supplied by fuzzy logic. It decides into yes, no. So yes, this patient requires fluid. No, this patient does not require fluid. The same fuzzy logic is being applied in artificial intelligence to make health decision making. So eventually you will start having some parameters fed into your system, which goes through mathematical algorithm of fuzzy logic, and it will tell you this patient is 56% safe to be given fluid. This patient has only 75% chances of fluid responsiveness. This patient has 90% chance of worsening after fluid. If you get this kind of data, it is going to be path breaking. So this is the kind of thing that we are expecting in future in next decade. Of course, West will see. We may never see it. We don't know. So these are already studies that has been conducted, disease-based modeling to predict fluid responsiveness in critically ill patients. What they picked up here is all the laboratory data is fed to the patient, not the hemodynamic data. So based on laboratory data itself, without your vital data, without your lung ultrasound assessment, your dynamic fluid responsiveness, based on disease modeling, predicting fluid responsiveness. This is excellent, because if you have this software and NMARS, large scale government purchases this, and you can actually, what will happen is at the peripheries, without doing actual dynamic fluid responsiveness test, this software can tell you whether the patient needs fluid or not. So of course, it has to have very high sensitivity and specificity, but some trials are already going on. So what to expect before retirement? As an young intensivist, before another 30 years from now, I would expect flow measurement to be more done at the bedside rather than pressures, because we just got so comfortable with pressures, we are actually not measuring flow, which is not correct. Of course, echocardiography has been path-breaking. We are actually measuring cardiac output. Thermodilution techniques are measuring cardiac output, but we want at the tissue level what is happening to each organ. I just hope in 30 years time the technology advances so much that we get to know what is happening at the tissue level. Say kidney, this is the weight of the patient. It's a fantasy, of course. Yeah, if I have a system which tells that, look, this patient's kidney weight is so many grams, the blood flow is so much, so per gram of tissue, this is the flow, you can optimize the flow, then it would be fantastic. Second thing is precision in measurement. Whatever you are measuring till now, some of them are quite imprecise. Your NIBP cuff itself, if it becomes more and more precise, we may have to do away with invasive monitoring. So if the technology advances so much that you have good precision, maybe that is one thing to expect before retirement. And artificial driven algorithm in Mysore. Finally, before I retire, some algorithms come in for safety limit. Everything is defined, and it tells us, our students, our future doctors, to be more safe. That is actually a fantastic thing that to happen before retirement. So points for exam going students, you should know certain studies: Andromeda shock, sepsis PAM, EGDT, all studies, reverse, promise, arise, process, survive sepsis guidelines, ESICM consensus statement. Authors to read is Xavier Monet, JLT, JLV, because these are stalwarts in fluids. Okay, every question is going to go towards fluid in resuscitation, so you should know about them. Our own Sheila Maitra ma'am, they have done your tidal volume variants. So please know our own authors who have done work of international recognition. Manu Malbrain, of course, you should know because he is trying to introduce the concept of intra-abdominal hypertension. So you should know, read through his lens what it is. And Janssen because of the lactate study, and Jan Baker also, a lot of studies he has done in terms of resuscitation. The books to read are critical care update books written by most of the students of critical care medicine and their mentors. Fantastic books, go through it. And of course, JLV update books will tell you what is happening in the West. So I don't know the examination pattern or the examination level kind of questions, but if your personal level is better than the standards set by the department, which should be better than the standards set by university, passing should never be a problem. Thank you for being such a patient audience. This is all my references. Most of the studies what I quoted, all the references are here. Now I am open to all your questions.
Thank you so much, madam, for almost 1 hour 25 minutes you have spoken.
I have to thank you all. Patiently you listened. I really hope that
it was actually a very helpful presentation. So most of the topics has been discussed. First we'll take questions actually. Ashwini ma'am, you want to ask yourself? Ashwini madam? Madam want to ask, in first scenario, can I straight away give 2 liters of keeping in mind ischemic heart disease in background? Instead, I can look at echo and long and ultrasound after 250 or 500 ml bolus because patient is an IH3.
Definitely. See, the reason why I told this was the scenario was put up because there are students who are going to work in a setup where you won't have ultrasound. So if you don't have ultrasound also, you go and give fluid is what the message was. See, if you have ultrasound, first thing you are going to do before your nurse loads up the fluid is you would have finished your screening, lung ultrasound and echo. So that quick your bedside lung ultrasound and echo is. So when you have everything, please use. Definitely, this scenario was added so that in a resource poor setting, how you would take a decision. This scenario was only for that.
Then how do I calculate extravascular lung water?
So that is an entire class in itself. You should have transpulmonary thermodilution and lot of intrathoracic blood volume and thoracic thermal volume. Both has to be minused, and global end-diastolic volume. Too many formulas, sir. I think it is little out of the present discussion. So it is available on internet. You can go through it. When you have a transpulmonary thermodilution, it will give you in the derived values. It's one of the derived values. It will only once you inject the cold indicator, it itself will give you the extravascular lung water index.
Anil sir, you can ask yourself, sir. Dr. Anil Kumar.
Good evening.
Yes,
hello, Suma. It was a fantastic lecture with more emphasizing on practical aspects. My question is, we use now regularly, even in the operating theatre, the what we use as the Fleth variability index as a measure for fluid responsiveness.
Yes,
I think I didn't see anything about that. What is your opinion of using PVI? Particularly, you were talking about the resource poor setting, where just a simple pulse oximeter with a perfusion index can measure, can give a valuable information that whether this particular patient is going to respond. Because the PVI, it shows us, actually it shows the changes that which reflects the physiological factors such as sometimes the vascular tone or the circulating blood volume, and we intraoperatively we use it. So what is your opinion or experience, or what is the present consensus on using PVI as an indicator of fluid responsiveness?
Sir, this is actually, you have yourself answered most of the questions. You have a pulse oximeter variability. What we are seeing is, instead of a pulse pressure variance, you can use it definitely. But as a goal for the variance to come down, I haven't gone through any studies, sir. I would rather read and then answer. Without answering, I'm not comfortable. Without reading, I'm not comfortable. I think I'm giving this question to somebody seniors. If there is any percentage cutoff for pulse pleth variability, if they know, well and good.
No, what actually we use here is we use cutoff as 13%. And there are many studies, maybe a few 78 major studies that I've used in ICUs. I don't have personal experience in using in ICU, but definitely it helps in at least intraoperative and postoperative management of our patient using the 13% as a cutoff value. I think, as you said, if somebody who has used in ICU will be a better person to answer this.
We have not used it, sir. We always had pulse pressure variability and systolic pressure variability available. So pleth index, no, and this is a measure of fluid responsiveness. So if the patient is fluid responsive, then go ahead and give fluids. That's all it is. The whole thing
Yeah,
is,
yeah, that's what.
have a goal.
No,
It can be used. If you say the 13% is the cutoff, then 13%. But the problem is, I don't know. I haven't read critically literature about pleth index itself, sir. We are so used to using PPV, SPV, we never went and saw the pleth index.
no, no, this is very reliable, I think, and relevant in terms of talking in a resource poor setting where a simple pulse oximeter, which costs about 5,000 rupees, a hand pulse oximeter, that is it is actually a Japan technology by Mesimo. So it gives both the pulse pressure index as well as the PVI, pleth variability index. There are many studies quoted, but I don't have personal experience in ICU, so I just wanted to know have you used it or have you got an experience? Okay, thank you, Suma. Thank you, Raghu sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable point actually here. Any more questions? Okay. Sumarata, that the CVP you told, no, most we have in regular teaching, we told that CVP should not be used for the preload responsiveness. But most of the presentation CVP is highlighted here. So yeah, it is very clear that CVP can't be used for the preload responsiveness. To give fluids, you can't see CVP. But the message was to see the back pressure. That is the serial values of CVP. That's what you mean to say?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the thing is, you cannot use it as a preload marker because there are multiple things that comes in between. LV compliance and then pulmonary artery pressure should be normal. There should be no pulmonary arterial hypertension. RV compliance should be good. Tricuspid valve should be good. Mitral valve should be good. Right atrial pressure should be normal. Then and venous capacitance should be normal. Then only will your CVP reflect your LV preload. So it is established that as a preload marker, you can never use CVP. CVP here is a safety marker. It has not gone out because a rapid rise in CVP will tell that back pressure for the end organs. End organs here is your kidney specifically and your abdominal organs and the soft tissues. It is telling that, look, we are getting congested. So please don't give too much fluids. That is the message here. CVP here is a safety limit only.
Okay. Thank you so much, madam, for that clarification. Any other questions? Okay. Sumarata, it was a fantastic presentation. It was the most useful presentation for all students. Thank you so much for your valuable time. And if with your permission, we use your PPTs in PDF format in our group. And also this webinar recording also will be utilized for the further student request. Thank you, Sumarata. Thank you all the audience.
All the exam going students. I don't know when their exams are. I wish them all the best. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
We'll give again and again opportunity, madam. No problem.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
ಆಯ್ತಪ್ಪ ಒಂದೂವರೆ ಗಂಟೆ One hour is way too much, no? Johnson class